Hi, I'm Larry Puckett, the DCC guy. Today I want to go over what I consider the 10 most essential tools for model railroaders. And being a DCC guy, a lot of them are electronics related. So don't let that overwhelm you, but you know, model railroading is heavy into electronics simply because our trains run on electricity. So at some point, you're going to have to hook up wires to the rails. You're going to have to do all kinds of things in order to make your locomotives run properly. And so what I'm going to show you are 10 essential tools for making most of that job easier. But there's a lot of other things that I'm going to look at that are just needed as part of putting together kits and your model railroad as a whole. So let's go ahead and get started. Hit that little red subscribe button, and when the little bell comes up, click on it and click all. Thanks now. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with a look at the 10 essential tools for model railroaders. And for that, I'm going to zoom in down here on the workbench and we'll start taking a look at them one by one. As you might expect, one of the things that I consider to be very important on my list anyway of tools for model railroads are soldering irons, because a lot of what we do with model railroading involves attaching wires to rails, to tracks, to motors, to decoders, all kinds of things that you're going to need to make a solder joint. So you need to have a good soldering iron. And be very careful about buying cheap soldering irons. You know, you can buy them, $5, $10, $15, something like that off of eBay, but you're going to be replacing it in a very short time because they're going to be very cheaply made. They're going to wear out. They're not going to last. So over time, I find it's just better to go ahead and lay out the bucks up front and get a good soldering iron that's going to last you your entire modeling career. Now, having said that, I've been through probably at least a half a dozen different soldering irons because I started out with some of the less expensive ones, and I learned my lesson that way. One that I used for many years is this Weller soldering iron station, and it allows you, it's got an on-off switch. It has a little potentiometer here up front that allows you to at least control the temperature within a given range, and the like. You can also change the tips, which is very important because you need an assortment of tips, because these big broad tips like this are good for soldering to rails, but you don't want to try soldering to a circuit board or little decoder wires using a big wire. Now, why don't I use this one anymore? Well, about 3 years ago, the folks at Soundtrax let me know that they were having problems with a doctor out in Sacramento who was just going through tsunami decoders one after the other. And they had an electronics engineer get in touch with him and find out what was going on. And he went over there and checked out his operation. They found out he was using a Weller iron just like this one right here, this same exact set, and the internal ground had disintegrated and it was leaking electrons out through the tip and burning up the audio output on the decoders that this fellow was installing in his locomotives. So as soon as he got rid of that iron and bought a new one, everything went away. So be very careful. I still keep this around for doing heavy jobs, soldering rail joiners and soldering feeders to track, that kind of thing, where I can be sure I'm totally isolated from electronics. But for my electronics work, I went ahead and bought this Hako, and it is a really highly rated soldering iron. It wasn't cheap, I'll admit. I got it off of Amazon. It was somewhere between $100 and $150. Like this one, you can control the temperature, but you can actually control the temperature. You can set it for 800 degrees or 600 degrees or whatever you want, and it's going to stay there. And you can also change the tips. So a lot of the time, what I use for electronics work is this very fine pencil point tip here, and for heavier work I'll use a flat tip like this one. So you can easily change those out and switch for different types of jobs. Now, also this one you know, it's rock solid. It comes on, heats up very quickly to the preset temperature. So I love it for that. It's also got this little built-in tip cleaner here. And this looks like, I'll show you one that I used to use. This looks like a piece of Brillo pad. And what it is, it's brass shavings. And it just, I mean, it's just a big wad of brass shavings. And you can stick your tip into here and the solder will come off and this will be clean. And that's one way to keep your soldering iron nice and fresh and clean. And I'll put a link to a video here above me to one that I did on how to do soldering. And everything you need to know, I think, about getting good solder jobs. Now, so you can either purchase one of these, and you know, I buy a lot of stuff from allelectronics.com, and that's where I got this and the base, so that's great to have around, makes it very easy to clean. It works a lot better than these sponges here. And typically what people used to do was keep this sponge moist, and then you can just wipe your tip across it, and the excess solder will come off and you'll get a clean tip. But that was a pain in the neck, keeping it wet and keeping it clean and the like, whereas this works a lot better. And they've included both here in the base for the stand on this soldering iron. So you've got the brass material here, and then you've got a sponge here. So whichever one you like, you're covered. Okay, some other things. And I go over this in the video. You'll need some rosin soldering flux. Do not use an acid flux. If it's got any kind of acid in it, you don't want it anywhere near electronics or your model railroad. But a good rosin soldering flux will work great. All Electronics sells it, lots of companies do. This is one that I've had for several years from Radio Shack. And another thing, tip cleaner. And this is basically, I think, a mixture of powdered solder and flux. And so you just run your bit or your tip of your soldering iron across this, and it will clean it and it will retin it, so it's nice and clean and ready to be used. Also, in model railroading, you don't use those big pieces of solder that you get up at the hardware store. You need something very fine like this. This one here is 0.022 inches in diameter. This one here, I don't even know that I can read it. It's on here somewhere, but I'm not sure where. But it's about the same diameter as this. And that's what you need, something very fine and thin to get in and solder on your locomotives, on your track, anything like that. You need a good thin piece of solder. Okay, and typically I use been using 60/40. I've been changing over to 63/37. The difference between that is the 60/40 has a range of about 5 degrees or so in which it stays liquid. And if you move it during that point, as it cools off, you're going to have a bad solder joint. Whereas the 63/37 and some of these others with different, this has got silver in it, you won't get that problem. It goes ahead and it changes from a liquid or semi-liquid to a solid immediately as soon as you take the heat off. So that's what you want, because you're not going to get what are called cold solder joints. Okay, let's move on to the next essential item. Okay, the second item on my list really segues from the soldering iron. These are called heat sinks. And what do you use these for? Well, one thing you'll find out once you've started soldering stuff to tracks and the like is you're going to have a tendency to melt things like the plastic ties and other items that you are working around. And one of the things you can do is by placing these little clip-on devices right here on your rails like this, they will absorb excess heat that would normally spread out the length of your rails and start melting the ties. So those are very useful for that. Another item you can use if you can't find these are just plain old alligator clips. And places like allelectronics.com sell these. I purchased these guys here from All Electronics 5, 6, 7 years ago. I don't remember when. The last time I looked, they did not have them anymore, but you could find these on Amazon and eBay, places like that. But these are great to have around. They're going to prevent you from melting your ties and desoldering other joints that might be close to the one you're working on. So I highly recommend picking up a set of these. Now, one of the things that you're going to be soldering a lot of is wire, and it requires all different sizes and types of wires to put a model railroad together. Now, for my bus wires, for my DCC bus, I use this 14 gauge wire. It's called zip cord because you can literally pull it apart like a zipper, and it comes in different gauges, and this is a 100-foot roll. And this stuff works very good, very well for power buses under your layout, DCC buses, a 12-volt bus, whatever. It's very convenient. You can split it at any point to connect feeders to the rails, that kind of thing. And because of the way that it is designed and it's very, very close proximity to the two wires, it tends to take care of some of the degradation in the DCC signal that you can get as a result of using other types of wire. And I'll put a link in the description as to where I purchased this. And it's typically used for wiring audio setups in houses, okay, for long runs, for houses, cars. I use the clear casing, and I know people are going to ask, how can you tell the different wires apart? Well, this one on the left is copper. This one on the right is tinned copper. So this one looks red, this one looks white, so you can see the difference. Literally, you can see it. I call this under the layout red, I call that white. Also, right here on the side of the red carrier or red conductor, there's a rib cast in, so you can feel which side is the red side. Very easy to tell. Otherwise, if you want to pay more, they make this with red and black insulation on it. But it's more expensive, I'll be honest. And All Electronics sells the red and black version. I'll put a link to the company where I found this material here, though. Okay, another thing that you can use is individual wires. And I picked this up at Lowe's, if I remember correctly. It's standard 14 gauge wire. It's solid conductor, red, green, numerous different insulation, vinyl insulation colors. So you can use it for a lot of different things. The problem with using individual wire like this for DCC buses is if you get over 30 feet, you should twist the two conductors one around the other. Otherwise, you'll get the voltage spikes and degradation of the signal that I just mentioned. So be aware of that, and I talk about that in some of the other videos that I've done on wiring. And by using this type of zip cord with the two conductors right against one another, you don't have to twist the two conductors together. This takes care of it because the reason that you twist the two different wires together in a bus is to get them very, very close to one another so that they will cancel out the problems that occur. Whereas with this, it comes already connected very close together. So it takes care of that. Now, other things, I use a lot of 20 gauge wire. This is 20 gauge stranded, and allelectronics.com sells this in various colors. And this is what I use for running a lot of wires to all of my tortoise switch machines. Anything on the layout that has to be powered that doesn't need a big wire like this, I can take a drop off and use this as a feeder. And I use these as my feeders to my track. Now, finally, this is very, very fine wire. I don't know, it's probably something in about 28 gauge. I'm not exactly sure what it is. I got this from Digitrax. It's a bundle of many different colors, and it must have been 10 feet long. And basically, if I need a wire for a decoder installation, something like that, I've got it. I can snip it off, and I'm ready to go. With all of this wire that you're going to need to work with, you need a way to cut it. And a pair of kitchen scissors, anything like that, just isn't going to work. I recommend getting an assortment or a couple of different wire cutters. This is an older one that I've had for many years. It's great for cutting small wire. This is for an intermediate. It'll go up to about 12 gauge. And for the big heavy stuff, this one here will really cut through some stuff. So you really do need to have a way to cut your wire. You don't want to be trying to use a pair of scissors or something that you've got. And you probably have one of these laying around in your toolbox already, somewhere in the house. Okay, another item, and that is a way to strip the insulation off of the ends of the wire when you get ready to make a solder joint, or you want to connect it to a screw terminal, whatever. Now this is a wire stripper. I think I got this one probably from allelectronics.com for about $5. I've got several of these here around the railroad. The reason for that is there's a little set screw right here, and that controls the size of the opening here in this notch that I can show you. And so you can close that down to various sizes to strip off the right amount of insulation, the right diameter, without cutting through the wire itself. And that is simply, all you have to do is undo this screw, move it up and down, and that controls how far it closes. But it's very imprecise unless you work with it a little bit. Plus, it can move around over time, so be careful, check that out. I find that I can just get to the point where I can hold it at a certain diameter and just pull the wire insulation off. But for more precise work, you can get a tool like this one. It's called a Powercraft, made by AMP Incorporated. And you can see there's a series of holes right here. Hold that up there, you might be able to see those. These vary in size from about 10 gauge up to 22 gauge. So you can put this right over a piece of wire, pinch it down, and just pull, and it's going to take off just the right amount of insulation and without creating any kind of damage to your wire itself. And that's an important consideration, because if you go ahead and use something like this and you start cutting into the wire itself when you're trying to strip insulation off, you run the chance of weakening the piece of wire, and it will break after a few bends if you're not careful. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to some more. Now, another thing you're going to need to do is when you make a solder joint in two pieces of wire, you're going to need to come up with some way to actually cover that joint so that you won't get a short circuit if it brushes up against another wire or a piece of metal or whatever that can ground it. So you need to have some way to cover that. And I'll be honest with you, I have seen videos on YouTube where people just use plain old cellophane tape, where they use electrical tape. I've seen folks use liquid rubber, and actually liquid rubber works fairly well. However, the thing I recommend is called heat shrink tubing, and I've used this in a lot of my I use this in my decoder installations and have mentioned it many times. All you have to do is cut off a little piece of this and of the right diameter, slide it onto the wire over your solder joint, and hit that with the tip of the soldering iron, and it will melt down in diameter by about 50%, and it will protect that joint. And it protects it from short circuits and the like, and also it helps to protect it from breaking over multiple bends, because it tends to support the joint a lot. So I recommend getting this. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different diameters here. I mainly use the two smallest ones, and all of these I got from allelectronics.com. And I swear, they have not paid me for this video. It's just that I buy a lot from them, have been buying from them for 20 plus years. And you can purchase this. You can get these in rolls, and I can't remember how long the rolls are, but I purchased these in 3 or 4 foot long strips, and that's the way that All Electronics sells them, and that's what I recommend you do. And then I just cut them into these sections about 5 inches long and keep them in a little drawer, a set of drawers that I have in my workshop. And this stuff, it is just the best stuff in the world when it comes to installing decoders in locomotives, because you don't want to be shorting out and killing a brand new decoder. Now, the next thing that I recommend is getting yourself a good X-Acto knife. Now, you can go ahead and purchase these fairly inexpensive ones. They're just made out of aluminum, and the blade just sits right in like that. And you can clamp down on it, and it's going to stay put. And I use this a lot. This is a number 17 Chisel Blade. It's great for when you want to cut something off of a sprue in a plastic kit, that kind of thing, or cut pieces of wood. strip material for various kits. But when you really want to do some serious work, I recommend one of these nice handles. You can get these from companies like Micromark and probably on eBay, I'm not sure, and Amazon. But again, it just unscrews, the blade comes out, a new blade goes in, and screw it down tight, and you've got a good blade holder. And this is great when you need to put a lot of pressure and do a lot of cutting, because it does begin to hurt after a while when you're trying to grip one of these metal blades. But these are great for incidental work. This is for the heavy duty stuff. And again, I use the number 17 blade and number 11 blade. And I buy these in quantities of about the blades themselves in packages of about 100 each. And this one will last me, 100 of them last me a decade. This one maybe 5 years. And it's always a good idea to have a good sharp blade when you're starting a new project, because a dull blade is going to end up damaging the material that you're working on, and also it can make it easier to slip when you're making a cut, and a dull blade will cut your finger just as fast as a sharp one, let me tell you. Okay, now, another one. We're on the home stretch now, folks. Forceps. Now, I like using curved forceps over straight forceps. It's so much easier to work just to pick something up like this as opposed to try to go like this. So a curved forceps or an angled forceps allows you to do that. This particular one, it's only about 3-4 inches long. Very good for fine work when you're working on kits. I like this one here because it's self-closing, so you can put stuff in it and set it down. I use this often to hold small parts that I'm soldering, pieces of wire, whatever. And it's just great if you need to clip something in, if you want to paint figures. Very, very good. But my go-to is usually this guy right here. It's about a 6 or 7 inch with a little angled tip here on the end, and this is great. You'll see these in the dental office a lot. They use these a lot. They're used in medical practices, and they're very easy to find at eBay. You can get these from Micromark. Lots of different places sell these. Okay, finally, let's take a look here. Hemostats. Hemostats are great. They're sort of like forceps, except you can use them to close down on stuff that you really need to grip. And these are something that I have an assortment of. Another little trick about hemostats is, so you can take a pair of these, clip them to the rails, and they make a great heat sink for doing soldering, because they'll pull off that extra heat that's being generated that would move down and tend to melt your ties and other joints nearby. And again, you can find these at places like eBay. You can get them off Micromark, probably Amazon, and I'm pretty sure that I got some of these from allelectronics.com. They have just lots of everything. Finally, the last item on my list is a good, what's called a multimeter. So it's a volt ohm amp meter. Allows you to measure all of these. This one is self-ranging. It will automatically change the output display for whatever range you're measuring. And that is very, very useful as opposed to having one where you have to preset it for a given range. That can be really confusing. But these things I use all the time. You can do continuity checks to see if you've got a good connection going to the rails. You can measure air, you can measure resistances. You can measure the voltage going to your rails. You can do all kinds of things with a voltmeter, and I did a video previously on using voltmeters. So I'll put a link to that one right here above me. You can find these on sites like Amazon.com. I don't recommend some of the ones. Be careful what you're purchasing if you get it off of eBay and some of these others. You can end up buying fairly inexpensive items that will not last you very long. I think I probably paid $45 for this one about 5 years ago, but I anticipate keeping it for about 20 or 30 more years. So it's going to last me the rest of my lifetime, and it runs off of a simple little a NiCad or lithium battery here on the inside. And this particular one comes with the probe type tips. And if I need to use any kind of clips type attachments, I can just do one like this and attach it to whatever I want to measure, and that allows me to switch over to clips. Some of the more expensive meters come with detachable leads so that you can swap between ones that have the probe type tips and those that have alligator clip type tips on them. And that can be very useful in many cases. But again, if you have a selection of these clip leads that you can just clip in and very quickly use them, it might very quickly make up the difference in the cost. Well, that's a wrap for today's video. I'm sure that a lot of the tools that I consider essential, some people might not think they are. And then I'm sure there are folks who consider other tools that they use to be essential in place of some of the ones that I have put forward. But, you know, that's just the way it is. Go ahead, add that to your comments. Tell folks about the tools that you consider essential. And don't forget to tell them why you consider them essential. That's a very important part. So that's it for this week. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you here next week with another video from the DCC Guide. Bye now.